My affair mocked my husband before he slammed the door and ran. TW, I got her pregnant too. I'm not sure if I'm looking for advice or just need to let it all out because if I'm being honest, this hurts to the bone. I never thought it would end like this. That I would be standing in the wreckage of everything that I have destroyed and realizing too late that I have hurt the person who loved me the most. It was supposed to be a simple lie, harmless sin, if there is anything like that. It was just a fleeting moment that had turned into something it was not supposed to. But somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that nothing will ever go wrong. I told myself I just needed to be careful. What I didn't know was that I wasn't just betraying my husband and I was betraying myself. And the moment I realized it was when the door slammed behind him. I'd been married to Michael for over 8 years. The man gave me everything, a roof over my head, all the comfort in the world, and a level of stability I had never known or even imagined before I met him. He was always the quiet one and the sort of person who made promises with actions, not words. But over time, I found myself restless and yearning for something I couldn't quite place. I felt my marriage life was boring and I needed some excitement or attention or something. It's not like James wasn't giving me attention, he was. He always did. He had all the time for me and that never changed, except that I changed. I wasn't supposed to be caught. We had planned it carefully, the times and places it would all happen. All of it was designed so Michael would never have to know. After all, why hurt him when he's never done anything wrong? But life doesn't follow plans, and I learned that the hard way. Fast forward to the day it all began. The day that led me down the wrong path. The day I wished never existed. So the thing is, Michael had always been proud of his friend from college. He'd tell me stories of a guy he used to know, the one he lost touch with as life pulled everyone in different directions. He talked about him with such admiration and how they'd been so close, and how he had been by his side through the wild ups and downs of youth. It was like he had finally reconnected with a part of himself, part of his past. He was not just an old friend, but he was someone my husband felt deeply connected to. So when this friend returned to the country and reached out to my husband, he asked me if we could invite over. I gladly agreed. I was really looking forward to seeing this man because of how well Michael spoke of him. So James came over and he brought stories of his own. He told us about the family he'd lost, the painful divorce he'd gone through, and the heavy responsibility he carried raising his son alone. It was a sad story and my husband wanted to be there for him, and honestly I wanted to be there too. He didn't stay with us for a long time that day. He had gotten a call and had stepped outside to answer it. When he came back, his face seemed a little more serious and he had to rush out. So later that day, my husband stepped out to go get something and I was home alone. I just came out of the shower after preparing dinner. I came out feeling refreshed and was still in my robe and my hair was damp when the doorbell rang. I almost ignored it, thinking Michael would handle it, but then I remembered he was not around, so I tightened the robe around myself and went to answer. When I opened the door, I was taken back for a second. There was a handsome young man about 25 years old with a charming and confident grin. He was talking and well-dressed in a way that looked effortlessly enchanting, and yet somehow casual. He has that kind of youthful energy that was magnetic, and for a moment he just looked at me when his eyes lingered a bit longer than necessary. There was something in the way he looked at me, maybe interest, and that look kind of took me by surprise. It felt personal. Then he asked if this was the home of Michael's, and I answered yes, that Michael was my husband and if he was looking for him. I tried to sound more relaxed than I felt. He nodded and told me his father was here earlier and he had left some important documents behind and had asked him to come fetch it. That's when I realized he was James's son, that son he was telling us about earlier. I invited him inside and for some reason I felt oddly conscious of how I looked. I told him to make himself comfortable while I grabbed the document. When I returned, he was standing just by the doorway and looking at some photos on the wall. And he flashed that smile at me again as he took the documents I handed him. He told me the place smelled amazing and asked if I was cooking. I laughed and said yes, that I just wrapped up and if he would love to stay for dinner before leaving. He looked at me again, roaming his eyes over my body and before saying, he wouldn't mind if it meant having dinner with me, but he was in a hurry. Something in the way he said that, so easy, almost daring, made my stomach flip. The words were innocent enough, but his tone carried something more, something almost playful. And it was strange, but at that moment, I felt a bit flustered. I brushed it off and scolded myself silently. Here I was, grown and responsible and feeling a little too fluttery over some kid. But the way he spoke to me, the way he looked at me, it was like he saw me as more than just his father's friend's wife. I hadn't felt that thrill in years, and I found myself drawn in, even if it was just a passing moment. When he finally thanked me and stepped out, he threw one last look over his shoulder and said I should tell my husband he's got a lucky home. And with that, he was gone. I stood there for a second after closing the door. I was feeling a strange fusion of emotions. He'd made an impression, that much was certain, but I shook it off. What was I doing? Daydreaming about a 25-year-old kid? When Michael came home that night, I mentioned his friend's son stopping by to pick up the forgotten document. Nothing more, just the facts. But later, as I lay in my husband's arms, my thoughts kept drifting back to the young man's smile, his easy confidence and the way he'd mentioned he would love having dinner with me, as if he actually wanted to stay. Days passed and I brushed it off as a fleeting moment, but then James began stopping by more often. The more of his presence meant more of his son's presence. Every time his son came along, he'd make a point to linger, and he always finds small ways to flirt with me, with that same spark in his eyes. Sometimes it was a compliment on my cooking, other times a remark on my outfit or how I wore my hair. And each time I'd laugh it off, but his words would stay with me long after he left. I've met plenty of handsome young men before. Neighbors, colleagues of my husband's, and even family friends, but there was something different about him. It was like he knew exactly what he was doing, and each time he left me flustered in ways I hadn't felt in years, and somehow that thought just stuck with me, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. One weekend, James stopped by again, and he brought his son along for what seemed like just another relaxed afternoon. I was about to head out to pick up some groceries, and his son asked if he could tag along with his usual grin on his face. Before I could answer, he turned to my husband and his father, shrugging as if it were the most natural thing, and said he will help me with the bags and get the heavy stuff and make sure I get it all back home safely. The suggestion earned a chuckle from his dad, which stated it was a good idea, and my husband agreed, smiling. Michael and James were completely oblivious to the undercurrent I felt when James's son looked back at me. We headed out, and I tried to brush away my curiosity about him, and I'd been noticing his attention, and a part of me couldn't ignore it, but I told myself it was a harmless interest. Nothing serious, and I won't fall for that. At the grocery store, things started out light and easy. We wandered through the aisles and joked about products and swapped little stories. His energy was infectious, and I found myself laughing more than usual and letting my guard down. Then, as I reached up to grab something from a high shelf, he came up behind me, and his chest almost brushed my back as he reached over and took it down for me. The sudden closeness startled me, and when I turned to face him, he was already looking down and smiling, and his eyes were warm in a way that felt so comforting. Before I could think of what to say, he leaned forward and gave me a gentle kiss on the cheek, and his hand roamed around my arm just long enough to make my heart jump. I blinked as I was caught off guard. So I asked him what that was for, and he looked at me with the same relaxed smile as he held my gaze, and said he figured I wouldn't mind, and he wouldn't have it any other way. His voice was low and almost a whisper, and the way he said it made my breath seize. There was a spark between us. It was undeniable, and it was like an electric current in the air. It was a thrill that ran deeper than just attraction. We stood there, staring and getting lost in each other's eyes. The tension grew as we continued shopping, and every brush of his hand and every shared glance only made that thrill intensify. And it was intoxicating. And the thrill of walking along a line I never thought I'd cross came with a blend of anticipation and guilt. After we checked out and loaded the bags into the car, we found ourselves standing in the back corner of the store, and both of us were hesitant to leave. There was a restroom nearby, and he gestured towards it with a playful smile, I felt my heart race as I nodded and followed him as if we'd both come to an understanding we never voiced out. Inside there, away from the curious eyes of the world, the magnetic pull between us became too much to ignore, and I found myself wrapped up in him, and our hands exploring each other and our breaths mingled. Everything else blurred, including my husband, and all I could think about was the fun of it and the excitement of finally letting loose. The thrill and the freedom felt like an escape from the mundane sex with my husband. He was lost in the moment as I was. When we finally pulled away and reality settled back in, and the rush was replaced by emotions I couldn't quite name, the weight of what happened stayed with me as we drove back home. There was guilt, but there was also excitement. I kept replaying those stolen moments in the grocery store and the pleasure of stepping out of the lines I'd drawn so carefully for myself. Yet as I sat there next to him, the reality of what I'd done washed over me like a cold wave. Just as we pulled up to the house, I turned to him. I needed to set some sort of boundaries, even though a part of me didn't want to. I told him we have to keep this a secret and that it can't happen again, that I had done something I shouldn't have and it doesn't feel right. I watched his face and I was half hoping he would tell me he felt the same, but instead he looked at me with that calm and confident smile and nodded, like he understood but not quite agreeing. He said if that's what I want, he will respect it. And for a moment his eyes held mine and I felt that pull again, the same one I'd promised myself to ignore. But we both stepped out of the car and walked into the house as if nothing had happened. That evening, as I sat with my husband, I pushed down the path of guilt and told myself it was over. I'd crossed a line and I needed to leave it there. But even as I told myself that, I felt that memory and a part of me not willing to let it go. Days turned into weeks and I did my best to go back to my normal life. But every time my husband's friend and his son dropped by, I felt that tug, an invisible thread pulling me closer to his son, and each time, his son found a way to connect and slip me a glance, or a smile, or a brush of his hand when no one was looking. It was subtle, nothing that would give us away, yet every look and every moment became a part of an unspoken conversation, and each exchange was a feeling that kept me coming back for more. Finally, one afternoon, after exchanging flirty text messages and resisting the temptation of falling back into lust, I texted him. I couldn't hold back any longer, especially when he said he couldn't stop thinking about me because even I, too, couldn't stop thinking about him. We met somewhere discreet. We planned it in such a way that neither his father nor my husband would ever know. I'd told my husband I was heading out to visit a friend, and he trusted me completely and gave me no reason to think he suspected anything. When we met up, it was like stepping into another world, one where nothing was forbidden and I could indulge in every fleeting impulse I'd ignored for so long. Sometimes we would meet at a hotel and I'd stay over telling my husband I went to my mom's place. So our meeting became a routine, and each time I left the house, a voice inside my head reminded me that I was taking a risk, but I ignored it as long as it wasn't affecting my marriage. When I was with Michael, I poured everything into our time together and made an effort to be present and keep things the way they've always been. And during the few times Michael and I had an intimate moment, it was more than amazing and more fun because during those moments, I saw my affair's face instead of Michael, and I'd go wild and everything would turn out perfectly. It was strange, almost unsettling how easy it was to slip between two worlds. In one, I was a wife devoted and loyal and having great moments with my husband, and in the other, I was someone else, reckless and adventurous and indulging in something I could never admit to anyone. But even though I was able to keep it hidden, there were moments when I felt the weight of my actions, the moments that made me question who I was becoming. The thrill was intoxicating, yes, but I knew deep down that I was walking a dangerous path, one that could lead to consequences I wasn't ready to face. Even when I always replayed the memories whenever I was alone, I wanted to stop, but every time I told myself this was the last, I found myself drawn back. It was as if I was caught in a dance, the one I knew wouldn't last forever, but felt too good to give up just yet. I knew we didn't have a future together. He was a college kid, and I wouldn't want to lose my husband because of him. So I was highly careful. As long as no one knew, I was content to keep our secret hidden, and told myself that I was still in control, even as I felt myself slipping further into it. Then the worst day of my life happened. The morning started out like any other. Michael had told me that he'd be out for the day and returned very late at night, so he asked me to stay at home to sign for a package. My affair and I had already made plans to meet that day, so because of the package Michael asked me to receive, we had to rearrange and meet over at my place. It was just going to be a quick visit, and we'd part ways before the evening as if nothing had happened. When he arrived, I barely hesitated, and we moved upstairs to the bedroom where everything felt forbidden, but yet somehow tempting. We made love multiple times on me and James's matrimonial bed, and I didn't care about it because I had forgotten all about the life I'd built outside of this. After that, we cuddled and we talked deeply about everything. He told me he was in love with me and that we should elope together, but I told him I can't. I couldn't abandon Michael and the life I had here for something that should have been a fleeting moment, and he was sad and told me he would take care of me. I said no, and he asked what am I going to do about the pregnancy. I told him that I would handle it. He shouldn't worry, and that he should forget that ever happened, and everything about us. Maybe it's time for us to part ways, because with the way everything was going, I was scared we would get caught. And he said he won't, and he can't, that he would fight for me, that he loves me, and that's when I knew I had made the biggest mistake of my life. We were so caught in the conversation that I didn't notice when my husband opened the door and found us naked on the bed. Michael roared angrily, and we jerked up at the sound of his voice, and my eyes widened at the sight of him. In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to rewind time, to undo everything that has led to this. His face was contorted with disbelief and a hurt I'd never seen before. His gaze bounced between the two of us like he was trying to make sense of something senseless. I became mute. I was short of words, and he said if this is what I've become and that I am not ashamed reducing myself to his level and insulting him. I wanted to speak, to explain, to say something that would lessen the blow, but no words came. Every excuse I'd planned to make if things ever go south vanished, and all I could do was stare and beat myself up mentally in regret. But then, before I could gather my thoughts, his anger shifted to my affair. He said he couldn't believe I'd sink that low. My affair looked at my husband with a smirk that only deepened the anger on my husband's face. He scoffed and said to Michael as he quickly grabbed his clothes and moved towards the door that Michael should mind his words. He wasn't low, and that if Michael had satisfied me the way a man should, I wouldn't have come looking for him. His words landed on me like punches. With a colder tone, he added, by the way, I got her pregnant too." Then he slammed the door and ran. My husband crippled on the floor. His eyes, once so full of love and trust, looked at me as though I was a stranger. As I sat there, the reality of what had just happened washed over me. I destroyed everything, shattered the foundation of trust and love we'd spent years building. I felt shame, guilt, and regret swallowing me whole. The thrill I'd chased now felt so distant and empty, and it was replaced by a hollow ache I knew would haunt me. I started crying and begging him, but he just stood up and left. I wanted to chase after him, to explain, to take it all back, but I knew that some things once broken could never be mended. What should I do? I know what I did was wrong, but I was going to end it. This is not how I expected everything to turn out. People make mistakes, right? I just wished I could make him unsee that. Update. I thought I had more time to fix it, more time to find a way out of this mess, to pretend I hadn't made the worst mistake of my life. But life doesn't wait for you to fix your mistakes. It doesn't give you the luxury of time to right your wrongs. No, it just comes at you full force, with no warning, and knocks you down when you least expect it. The truth is, I didn't know what love was until I lost it. Until I saw the man who'd given me everything walk out that door, without a single word. And in that moment, I realized that I never should have let my selfishness define who I was. I never should have let the idea of excitement lead me to ruin something so precious. I thought I was in control, but in the end, I was the one who lost everything. Michael threw me out of his home, and I cut ties with James' son and got rid of the pregnancy. I couldn't keep it. I couldn't accept the reality of it. I've always wanted to have a child, but not in that kind of a way. I tried my best to make it up to Michael, but he didn't want to hear anything. He said he felt betrayed and insulted, and I understood him because all he's ever done was love me, and I took it all for granted. I was foolish to think I would get away with everything. Now I am deep in regret. I received the divorce papers this morning because he couldn't bear being in a marriage with someone like me. And that's okay, except that I am not okay. I never wanted to lose Michael. He was my everything. I thought maybe, just maybe, I could turn things around and tell Michael how sorry I was, how much I regretted everything. But what I didn't realize was that words would never be enough to undo the damage I had caused. And now, I'm left alone with pieces of my broken heart. I hope someday I'm able to glue it all back because I'm not sure I can. Thanks for reading, Reddit. I feel so embarrassed and ashamed, but someday I'll hope to get over everything.